that, y'all. Okay, so let's see if there's anything else I need to mention there. Space exploration, if you look on the next page right above where it says foreign policy under Kennedy, lots of advances, what we call spin off technology that has improved our lives. Obviously, satellites, right? The satellites that warn us about hurricanes and give us amazing views of the weather. They also, of course, help you and me communicate faster with our cell phones or to watch stuff live happen on the other side of the world. Radio signals, okay? We can predict all kinds of things. The fact that you and I can use GPS to know within a few feet of where we are, y'all. GPS obviously comes from this because it uses global positioning satellites. New solar cells that help power all kinds of things today. Some people's houses that came from the space program because we put those on it to get power in space. Very fancy types of lubricants, thermometers, better food, various power tools, special foam and mattresses. Like I said, the stuff that makes calculators possible, y'all. A lot of your early computer technology, all of that comes from it. All right, so let's look at foreign policy. Now, at the end of World War II, remember at the Potsdam Conference and before that at Yalta, the decision had been made to temporarily, it was believed, to divide Germany into an eastern part occupied by the Soviet Union, as well as a western part that would have the United States, would have France, and would have Great Britain in it. And then likewise, the capital of Berlin would be divided into an East Berlin controlled by the Soviets and a West Berlin controlled by the United States, the British, and the French. Okay. Now, in 1948, Stalin closed off West Berlin. There was only one road leading to it, and we had to have an airlift of planes bringing food and basically salt and coal and everything. And we fed West Berlin for almost a year, y'all, and it really helped solidify the support there. That leads to us forming NATO. But Germany continued to be divided when Kennedy comes to power. Now, when Kennedy comes to power, y'all, and this is something that is sad about JFK. JFK, y'all, had maybe one healthy year in his entire life. In fact, Bobby, his brother, used to say, I feel sorry for any mosquito that bites it because it's going to get whatever kinds of diseases. Kennedy especially had bad back problems and had to take some legal and not so legal medicine to deal with that. Lots of painkillers. So he goes to meet Khrushchev, and here the two really measure up each other, right? Khrushchev wonders, who's this new guy? Am I going to be able to push him around or not? And Khrushchev goes over there to Vienna, Austria, a neutral country, and meets Kennedy. Kennedy has seriously just hurt his back and he's on painkillers. Kennedy makes the mistake of trying to convert Khrushchev, a communist, into a capitalist. And Khrushchev just lays into him and talks for hours. And Kennedy's medicine wears off and he begins to hurt. And he really can't do a whole lot to defend himself because he's in such pain. And when Khrushchev leaves, he tells his interpreter, I pity the United States that such a great country has such a weak man for its leader. And this is important, y'all, because he's going to believe and he's going to try to take advantage of Kennedy, and he really misjudged Kennedy. Khrushchev, y'all, threatened that he would close off Berlin. Kennedy says, oh, yeah, you're going to close off Berlin, buddy? Well, I'm going to increase the spending for the military. I'm going to make more Americans get bomb shelters. We're going to build a lot more shelters for our people. And so Kennedy responded with the threat that way, but the damage had already been done. Now, Khrushchev is going to take advantage of what he perceives as weakness to build a wall. Now, the first wall, y'all, was just mainly barbed wire and stuff like that. But over time, a series of walls made out of brick, made out of concrete and all kinds of things with an elaborate safety measures. I mean, they had attack dogs. They had mines. They even had barbed wire in the river, y'all, to make sure that people could not get through. And I wish I could talk more about this. I've been there, I've studied this a lot of my life, but it was shocking. And to a lot of people, they just couldn't believe that we would do nothing about it. Well, what could you do? If you knock it down in that an act of war, it's on their land, right? And in fact, y'all, it turned out to be a really great psychological thing for the United States because, even though they said they built this wall to keep capitalists from coming in and sabotaging their socialist experiment, everybody knew they were building this wall to keep all of these East Germans from leaving. East Germans, y'all, were fleeing by the thousands. Much like people are leaving Latin America and a lot of places in the world to get away from bad conditions to come to the West to get a better chance, right? And so that's why they had built the wall, basically to lock their people in. Now, Kennedy was over in Europe. This is in June of 63. He has about 5 months to live. Of course, he doesn't know that. And he delivers a very, very famous speech. Okay. And let's see if it will play here.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
I've got this a little bit out of order because I should have talked about Bay of Pigs first. That's actually sooner. But I guess since we're doing Berlin Wall, might as well bring it up. So those are the famous words, Ich bin ein Berliner. Now, a lot of people look at this and they say he just said he was a jelly donut because a Berliner was a type of sandwich that you could get. He probably shouldn't have said it the way he did. That's what some guy told him the translation was that worked for the State Department. But you could hear the people cheering. They weren't like, what? The president just said he was a jelly donut? They knew what he meant. In fact, the place where he gave that speech is still called Kennedy Plaza to this day, and they still remember him. In fact, when he got assassinated, West Berliners, y'all, throughout the city put candles in their windows. They knew they had lost one of the greatest champions of freedom that they had. And, the thing is, Kennedy let them know, look, if the Russians come into West Berlin, we will fight. There are American troops there, like in Korea, they will die, and we will fight and keep the Soviets out. And they believed him, all right? So the Ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner speech really showed. And he really said he took pride in the words because these Berliners, y'all, they were on the front line against communism, okay? Now, Kennedy met various leaders around the world, of course. There you see him meeting Willy Brandt, and he met some leaders of some other places. Now, this is not on your AP. Oh, it's listed for Star too. If you look under foreign policy before the Bay of Pigs, you'll see the Alliance for Progress. This is definitely something you should know both for AP as well as for Star. Now, if you remember, the Marshall Plan that President Truman had passed had helped rebuild Europe after World War II, right? Even our own enemies were helped to keep them from becoming communists, for making communism less of an attraction. The Alliance for Progress, in a way, was to try to do for Latin America, 20 years later almost, or 15 years later, what we had done for Europe. The idea was trying to make sure that there were no more communist coups like Castro, who had taken over Cuba in 1960. We would try to maintain democratic governments. We would encourage some of those governments which weren't very democratic to maybe open up to more parties, political parties and stuff like that. We would also see to it that we get them some aid for industrial things, help them out, agrarian development. One of the big problems in Latin America, and still is to a certain extent to this day, is a very unequitable distribution of wealth. You have some very wealthy people who own percents of the country, not just acres, but percents of a country, a lot of it. And this had been a real problem. And so the hope was that these countries, their leaders, would make some of these changes. We wanted some good economic ties, kind of like Franklin Roosevelt with his good neighbor policy, try to push for land reform, tax reform to help the poor, get the governments more stable so we don't have a Cuba or even what had happened down here in Guatemala. I don't know why Guatemala is not on the map. But what had happened down there, and we'd helped, the Eisenhower administration had helped overthrow a socialist government. We were basically trying to offset, what Castro and his buddy Che Guevara were doing, trying to encourage revolution in Latin America. But sadly, y'all, a lot of the leaders of Latin America just weren't interested. They didn't do their part. They didn't make some of these changes, which is why today a lot of these countries are very unstable and we've had issues. And less than 10 years, or well, about 11 or 12 years after Kennedy proposed it, the Alliance for Progress failed. So be aware of that. All right, let's go up a little bit and talk about what happened to Cuba. Now, Cuba, as you guys probably know, isn't that far from the United States. In fact, if you go to the very tip of Florida, that is the Keys, the Florida Keys, and you go to Key West, which I've been to a few times, they have a sign there. And you can't see Cuba, but it's only 90 miles away, okay? Now, in 1960, Fidel Castro had taken over, and he took over American businesses there. They were nationalized. That is, basically, they take over that and they don't pay people back. The United States broke off relations, and we saw Castro as an enemy. He came to visit the United States. He spoke at the United Nations. He wanted to meet our president, President Eisenhower, who was finishing up his term. Eisenhower made sure he was out of town. Instead, he met Vice President Nixon. And Nixon wrote up a memo that he said, this dude's a commie. And trust me, I know my commies, kind of thing. And so Eisenhower and Nixon, because everybody believed Nixon would be president, right? They began a plan to get a lot of exiles, people who had left Cuba, your doctors, your lawyers, your teachers, your intelligentsia, your smart and wealthy people had left to get away from Castro. We began training them down in Central America. They ordered their uniforms from the Sears catalog, believe it or not. Now, everybody imagined that when Eisenhower finished being president, Nixon would be president, and Nixon would just go ahead and have this invasion go through. Well, surprise, surprise, golly, Nixon didn't get the presidency. And instead, Kennedy comes in, and as I told you, he was probably informed about this plan in advance. Also, Eisenhower, y'all probably had what's called plausible deniability, where he didn't say it himself, but we did have elements of the Central Intelligence Agency, that's the CIA, meet with mafia people. And I ain't making this up. This ain't weird. This ain't some weird conspiracy thing. The CIA met with mafia people and planned to assassinate Castro. That was going to kind of happen at the time of the invasion. So when Kennedy becomes president, Kennedy's very nervous about this so-called Brigade 2506, right? And it says never abandon our country, right? That was their motto right there. And Kennedy is nervous about it. He thinks, man, it's kind of like what Biden's going through right now. How much help is too much? How much does it become until you are literally at war with that country? Now, Cuba, since the United States had turned its back to it, had been getting a lot of aid from the Soviet Union. Khrushchev had like a bromance, y'all, with Castro. They were good buddies. And so Khrushchev was sending aid. He was sending tanks and airplanes like crazy to Cuba. And eventually he would send missiles, as you guys probably know. But anyway, Kennedy's getting kind of nervous, and he moves the location of the invasion to La Bahia de Conchinos, which is my bad Spanish for the Bay of Pigs. Turns out to be a bad choice because it's kind of surrounded by swamps. Now, the invasion goes really badly. 1,200, 1,300 of these guys land, y'all. They never get off the beach. For one thing, Castro knows it's coming. Maybe not where, but he knew approximately when and where. His forces hit those guys on the beach. A lot of the people in Cuba that we hoped would rise up, we thought these guys might inspire an uprising. After all, Castro had, at one point, y'all, Castro had been down to less than 20 followers. We really hoped that these people would inspire a revolution against Castro, but it doesn't. And sadly, y'all, and I've studied the Bay of Pigs a lot. I know you guys think, man, that's almost what he does, but I mean, I've read the CIA report, which is like 5 volumes. I've studied this like crazy. I was supposed to go visit it twice, and sadly, the trips have been canceled because of our weird relationship with Cuba that our country has now. But the thing is, those guys fought really bravely, y'all. They have nothing to be embarrassed about. They held out for about 3 days, getting the you-know-what shot out of them. And finally, those that were not dead had to leave. Now, this is going to leave a lot of anger. I mean, they were captured. Those that couldn't leave were captured. And eventually, we traded medical supplies and tractors and stuff to get them back. And Kennedy told them, they gave him a flag that they had flown in their invasion. And he says, this flag will fly over a free Havana, you know? But the thing is, Kennedy had tried and it had failed. Now, those guys had been led to believe that if the invasion went south, if it went bad, in other words, that there was no way the United States would just leave them hanging out there and dry. Our own guys that were working with them, trained them, said, look, if this goes bad, you can trust the United States. We've got carriers off of there. We'll send planes in. We'll come in and do that. And it's possible they might have done that. But there's some evidence now that has come out, y'all, where basically, apparently, Khrushchev, seeing this and knowing this was probably put up by the United States, basically says to Kennedy, look, dude, if you support these guys any more than you already have, we're going to go into Berlin, West Berlin. And of course, if they go into West Berlin, we've got World War III, y'all, right? And so Kennedy let those guys be captured. It was awful, awful choice he had to make, but that's what we think happened. Now, this is going to lead ultimately to the Cuban Missile Crisis of, all the way from August to November, but particularly 13 scary, scary days. My wife, who's a few months older than me, was actually born during this time. She said she was scared to death. I know I was scared to death. I was in my mother's womb and I was shaken. Of course, but I was actually only a few months away from being born. I would have never been born had this ever happened, y'all. Now, a U-2 flight, remember the U-2, we had talked about that with Eisenhower, was a top secret plane that could fly very high heights over the area, and it had picked up pictures of missiles, what looked like missiles, and ultimately we would send super fast planes, Crusaders, to take close-up pictures. And so we had at the end of August confirmed that they had put surface-to-air missile batteries. Now, why is that a big deal? Surface-to-air can't hurt you and me here, but in Russia, wherever they have their nuclear weapons, y'all, they have these surface-to-air missiles in case anybody comes to attack them. So when we saw the surface-to-air missiles, we're like, oh my gosh, they're getting ready to put some nuclear missiles there, okay? Now, ultimately, we had some people, we had spies working for us that figured out where most of the missiles were, okay? Now, this was the deal. At first, we thought they were a little bit shorter missiles, and all they'd be able to do is maybe get to San Antonio and just almost get to Washington, D.C. And then later we determined that they were even longer range missiles, and within about 15 minutes, y'all, they could hit everything from to San Francisco all the way in. About the only place spared, y'all, would be Seattle and Portland, maybe. The rest of the country, including a good chunk of Canada and Central America, y'all, could be destroyed. And South America could be destroyed in a few minutes. All right, so Kennedy, y'all, is getting ready to have his midterm elections. Remember, this is October and September 1962. If he looks like a wuss, if he can't do anything, that narrow group of Democrats he has, y'all, will probably be kicked out of office. And also, in 2 years, of course, he doesn't know he's going to be assassinated, but in 2 years, he's running for president. He can't look like a wuss. He can't just say, well, let's leave the missiles there as long as they don't use them. And in fact, y'all, we had put missiles in Turkey, which was just as close to the Soviet Union as missiles in Cuba were to us. And in a lot of ways, they were just like, hey, you got missiles in Turkey, we'll put missiles in Cuba so that we can hit you just as quickly as you can hit us, right? And eventually, as I said, we sent Crusader planes that flew super low, and they were able to identify these medium-range ballistic missile sites in San Cristobal, okay, and get some good pictures and even lower altitude pictures here. And each of these missiles, y'all, was the strength of 50 atomic bombs, right, that had leveled Hiroshima. So, you're talking about probably about 100 kilotons of power, enough to wipe out a city, each of them, okay? So this was pretty scary. Now, Kennedy had learned with the Bay of Pigs that he needed people he could trust, that he should, and because he had some second thoughts about the Bay of Pigs, but he thought, hey, I'm a young guy, these guys know what they're doing, and he went with it, and he didn't even let his brother know. Well, with this crisis, he decides to bring in especially his brother, as well as his Secretary of Defense, McNamara, and his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. And they met. Now, the thing is, Kennedy had a couple of choices here, right? And what's beautiful, y'all, is Kennedy recorded. We only found this out a few years ago. Kennedy had a little button at his desk, and he could push it, and it would record. And so we have, y'all, the complete recordings pretty much of all the discussions about what do we do. Kennedy got a close group of advisors, people he could trust, people he believed in, and he called them X Committee, right? And they met. Basically, the options he had. Most people, including him, believe what we have to do is we're going to have to order airstrikes. And we got to hope that we knock out every single one of those missiles before they can be ready. Because they were in the process of getting ready. You don't just set up a missile, in like 30 minutes or something like that. So we need to know where every one of them is, and we need to knock every one of them out. Trouble is, y'all, there were a lot of Soviets working around those missiles. And so Soviets would die. How would we feel, y'all, if the Soviets attacked, say, Turkey and killed a bunch of Americans? We would probably want war. The second thing that eventually was proposed is what would be called a quarantine. Now, technically, a blockade is an act of war. And so McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, comes up with this idea. Why don't we put a quarantine and stop Soviet ships from bringing any more missiles and any more parts of the missiles? Trouble is, would the Soviet ship stop or not? What happens if we say stop and they just run through the quarantine line and then we shoot at them and then maybe hit them or sink them? What are we going to do? Well, Kennedy, and there was even possibly all the thought of an invasion. We bomb everything, then we invade, and then we try to find all the missiles before they can be ready to go. Or, of course, he could do nothing, but he would probably lose re-election. Democrats would lose control of the House and Senate, as narrow as it was. So Kennedy first goes with the quarantine or the blockade. All right, let's see if this video will play here. This is from a movie, all right, here. And so pretty freaking scary, y'all. What would happen, right, with that? Now, in the meantime, we worked in the United Nations, right? Remember the great hope of solving problems around the world. League of Nations had, helped us in the war against Korea in 1950. Now it would be asked to help us make a case for what the Soviets would do. We got most of our South American or Latin American allies on our side. They supported us in this. But the thing is, the Soviets, y'all, were denying the whole time that they had any missiles there. Our ambassador to the United Nations was Adlai Stevenson. And Adlai Stevenson, many people believe, was too weak. He'd run against Eisenhower twice and lost. And they thought, all right, so that's how that was handled. But the missiles were still there. So what happened? Well, a handful of the ships did pass through the quarantine line, but they turned around, most of them. But we know this today, and this is not really on the PowerPoint, y'all. I don't know if you guys are religious or not, but sometimes I have to think there's a higher power, because there was a Soviet submarine out there, y'all, that had atomic tipped torpedoes. Now, if one of those had been fired, it would have wiped out a whole fleet of American ships, killing tens of thousands of Americans. And Americans wouldn't have put back with that. Now, that ship was temporarily out of contact, and two of the three men who had to make the decision whether to fire the nuclear weapons or not had decided already, when they surface, they're firing the nuclear weapons at the American ships which were nearby. One of the other man worked hard, and he believed this was just a problem of communication. He talked and he talked, and he convinced them not to fire that missile. That man today is referred to as the man who saved the world. Can you imagine? I mean, had those missiles been fired, y'all, it might all have disappeared right then and there. And instead, it didn't happen. Now, ultimately, how did this work? Well, Bobby Kennedy, particularly the president's brother, made a deal we didn't know for a lot of years. Now, the way it was supposed to work was like this. The Soviets would announce that they were taking the missiles out, and they would do so. In return, we would announce that we would not invade Cuba. And that apparently is still the agreement. We won't invade Cuba. We won't even try again like the Bay of Pigs. But you have to take the missiles out. And then also this was the other part. The Soviets held out for those missiles in Turkey. Now, this is the crazy thing. Those missiles were old, going back to the 50s. We had plans already to remove those missiles. But if we announced we're removing our missiles and we're pledging not to invade Cuba, it would look like we had wussed out, that Khrushchev had won this. So in turn, y'all, what we did instead was we made a deal. We said, look, we'll announce publicly we won't invade Cuba. That'll give you a win. But we will remove the missiles from Turkey within 6 months. But it cannot be considered a quid pro quo. In other words, that you're doing this, and in return, we're doing this. We don't want it to be announced. And sadly, y'all, I mean, it was good that it happened that way, that we got this victory, and it helped Kennedy hold the House and Senate in 62. But Khrushchev looked weak. He looked like he'd been reckless, and worse, then he'd been a wuss, and he'd given in to Kennedy here. And so Khrushchev was overthrown about 2 years after this. And a hardliner, somebody a lot tougher by the name of Brezhnev, was put into power. So ultimately, this cost Khrushchev, y'all, his job. Okay? Now, Kennedy, as you can see here, kind of kept the spending on military weapons. I mean, pretty even with what Eisenhower had done since the 50s. This is obviously during the Korean War, but you can see he built up a little bit, but, he didn't go wacko or anything like that. Now, among some of the things going on, y'all, I mean, I urge you to read more about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was terrifyingly scary. For one thing, one of our U-2 planes got shot down. The pilot killed. A lot of people wanted to go to war over that. In the meantime, too, we had a big test of a nuclear weapon. There were China and India temporarily went to war. It looked like everything was falling apart. And after 2 years of not having atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, on September 1st, the Soviets went back to it. And here you see a hydrogen bomb. This thing, y'all, 500 times as powerful as the bomb that blew up Hiroshima, maybe even more powerful than that. Okay, and we continue to test our weapons out in the desert, out in Nevada. I've been out to that test site, left me with a glowing personality. So anyway, now, one of the last things Kennedy did, this was 5 months before his death. It's one of my favorite speeches. He's addressing Khrushchev and the leader of Britain, Prime Minister Macmillan, and basically making an offer to stop these nuclear tests. And here is the great line. For, in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal. This was at American University.
Chosen this time and place. Discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds. The truth too rarely perceived. And that is the most important topic on earth. Peace. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense. In an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces.
I'm going to fast forward here a little bit here.
But there are many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage.
For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal.
Okay. And so Kennedy got a treaty through that affected the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, 3 of the world's nuclear powers. But China and France, who were relatively new to the nuclear club, they refused to sign it. Underground testing would continue in the United States until the 1990s. But what we banned, y'all, and this was just a little hopeful sign, no longer could you test nuclear weapons in the atmosphere like people did where you set them up above ground and you do testing. No longer could you test them underwater, believe it or not. Especially the French like to test them underwater. And we had done some ourselves, or in outer space, which some people were proposing. So Kennedy is able to get this done. And then here you see his words here. Yesterday, a shaft of light cut into the darkness. And he says, look, we've come up with a banned nuclear test in the atmosphere, outer space, underwater. And this was a hopeful sign, right? And many people too, y'all, Khrushchev's still in power for another couple of, about a year after this point. We don't know that he's going to be overthrown, but a lot of people like, wow, there's hope. And to be honest, y'all, the Cuban Missile Crisis, those 13 days that we, the people, knew about it, had scared the you-know-what out of us. We built a red phone line that we could send. We could call, the president could call and talk to the Russian leader at any time. It really made people nervous, like, we nearly blew up the whole world, y'all. We can't let this happen again. So Kennedy's first step here is to stop people from testing all these bombs in space and that, because, that was dangerous anyway, and it was damaging the country.